Good evening and welcome tonight, or part two of our four-part presentation on our world famous freedoms, from whence did they come and what they did cost. In our first presentation, I'll summarise very quickly, we found that there was an attempt by the media to discredit the royal family in the eyes of the English speaking people around the world. That came from several secular sources, but they all agreed that no one knew who would want to destroy the royal family. Well, we went back through Earth's history and we saw that the Queen was the defender of the Protestant faith, that she was the head of the Church of England, and that Rome had ruled for 1260 years through the union of church and state. Remember, the higher finger is the church, the smaller one is the state, and the only power Rome has is through the union of church and state. And that is why Pope John Paul II, when he was in Poland in 1987, condemned the separation of church and state, simply because when the church and state are separated, then they cannot be, the Rome cannot use its pliers and instruments of torture against those who disagree with her ever-changing, biblically contradicting Babylonian traditions. And so we went through, we showed the various kings of England that had stood up against popery, how King John was humiliated into picking his crown off the earth, showing the significance of popery's claim over the kings of the world. This contradicted St. Peter, the professed first pope, who said in 1 Peter 2:13 that we were to subject ourselves to the kings of this world. That is, of course, until the king's asked to do something that contradicts the word of God. And so we went down through English history. We showed the Spanish Armada sail upon England. We saw the Queen, Mary Tudor, in 1547 when she took the throne, or 1553 when she took the throne. She promised to look after the liberties of the English people. These smooth words gained to the throne, and she immediately threw off her disguise and took England back to popery. 350 of England's best sons were murdered at the stake at Smithfield and other places. They're burnt at the stake. And so we see a pattern evolving where the papists believe in the principle that the end justifies the means, that for the glory of the church they can tell lies. But the Bible clearly condemns that, where it says you shall not do evil that good may come. And so we saw after her, we had the bonny reign of England under Elizabeth I. Then we saw the Spanish Armada sail to try and destroy Protestantism in England. We saw that there was 20,000 troops and sailors, and all Roman Catholics, all ready to die for the Pope. And yet God intervened in Earth's history. If ever God intervened in the history of men between the cross and today, it was with the sinking of the Spanish Armada. It changed the Earth's history, and that's why we're speaking English tonight, and why we're not speaking Spanish and have rosary beads attached to our belts. And so then came James I. They tried to blow up Parliament on November the 5th. They were exposed, and the Jesuits were killed, not for their faith, but they were in a sense because their faith allowed them to blow people up, which contradicted their professed leader, Jesus Christ, who said, harm no man and pray for them that despitefully use you. And so then we saw the significance of his reign. The authorised King James Bible came on the scene and has been the pillar of the English-speaking language ever since. It's been the bulwark of our principles, our freedoms, and this we're going to see in this second part two presentation where we got our Protestant monarchy from and why Rome is trying to overthrow it. And so that was a brief summary of last night's presentation. Now we see our world famous freedoms part two. From whence did they come and what did they cost? We saw after James I of England and James VI of Scotland died, Charles I came to the throne in 1625. He was a secret papist. He married a French Roman Catholic princess. 2 months after Charles I became King of England, he married Henrietta Maria, the daughter of King Henry IV of France. The marriage treaty required her to be accompanied to England by a Roman Catholic bishop, 28 priests, and a number of French Catholic attendants. A secret clause promised the abolition of penal laws against the English Catholics. Charles failed to fulfil this secret clause. The new Queen tried to convert her 7 children to Roman Catholicism. At that time, the Roman Catholics revolt in Ireland and kill 100,000 Protestants in 1641. The Roman Catholic Irish rose up in revolt against the taking of lands for settlement by both Scottish and English Protestant settlers. Some claim 200,000 were killed, others claim it was much less. Eventually, Irish gentry ruled with the Roman Catholic Church. They ignored the English Parliament, who still considered Ireland to be part of their kingdom. Remember, we'd shown you in the first night's presentation that Pope Adrian IV had given Ireland to the kings of England. And so the English, or the Irish, who believed in the Pope and they believed in Catholicism, had no bone to pick. And yet one of the things that was done, is not taught in the school books today, is that Charles I sends 8 English ships to destroy the French Protestants at La Rochelle. The siege of the Huguenot city of La Rochelle by the French fleet in 1627. Many of the 8 ships, all but 2 of the sailors on board, refused to sail. The king, when they found out they were going to fight their Protestant brothers in La Rochelle, which is in the Bay of Biscay in western France, and when they found what their mission was, the whole lot of them sailed the ships back to England, got off the ships, and Charles I threatened them with death, and all but 2 refused to go and fight against their Protestant French brothers. And so King Charles I appointed papal bigot Laud. Archbishop Laud was a miserable, nasty man. I'm sorry to say that, but he mistreated his fellow so-called travellers in the Christian way. Charles I was a secret papist, but he didn't want to lose his throne. But if you look at his fruits, he certainly helped the Catholic Church regain territory. In 1628, Charles I appointed the closet Catholic and bigot Laud as Bishop of London. He persecuted all those who opposed him in religious matters. In desperation, the Puritan immigration to America became a flood. In 1633, Laud was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. He used his influence to attempt bringing popery back to England. Laud tortured thousands of Protestants. In 1637, many in the Church of Scotland refused the Romanised prayer book. Laud executed many for this disobedience. And so we see the prayer book not being received very well in Scotland. You can see in that picture the people threw stones at the Jesuit preacher, and the man in the pulpit is under attack. Scotland rises in revolt against the Catholicised new prayer book in 1638. In 1638, Scotland rose in a revolt against Charles I's attempt to impose Church of England prayers there. They believed it to be too close to Catholicism. The King's attempts to put down the rebellion failed. To the Scots and the English parliaments, this appeared to confirm that Charles was a tyrant who wanted to impose Catholicism on his kingdoms and to govern again without reference to his parliament, as he had done in 1628. And that was called, the Scottish uprising was called the Bishops' War, when they refused the hymn book because in it had the Catholic Mass. Many of the Protestant or professed Protestants today have the Catholic Mass in their hymn books, but they're too polite to complain about it or protest. At that time, we see the Puritans were being held back under Elizabeth. The Puritans were developing more of a Bible knowledge, but Elizabeth and James I were both Protestants, but they didn't allow the Puritans to get too far ahead of the rest of the country because they knew they had a large number of dissatisfied Catholics who were prepared to go along for the ride. But if the Queen or the King, in the case of Elizabeth I and James I, had pushed the Puritan cause too much, then what would have happened is there would have been a civil war as the Catholics intolerably rose up. And so the Puritans were withheld from exercising all their prerogative. They went to America to enjoy the liberty of conscience. And what they yearned for themselves, as American history shows, At first, they were reluctant to hand on to others, but there they are, setting sail to the new world. Little did they know they'd become the greatest nation on earth. Here we see in 1620, Pilgrim Fathers escape religious bigotry and arrive in America seeking liberty in religious matters. I believe that is a reference from Revelation 12:16. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And so God's Puritans, when they landed in America, there was the sick and dying in their ships. They went there so they could worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. They'd never see England again, but little did they know they'd laid the foundations for the greatest nation the world has ever seen. And of course, Bible students know that there's a reference to that in Revelation chapter 13, 11 to 18. There are two beasts in Revelation 13 which are affecting the world today, and it's going to enforce the mark of the beast. One would be welcome to order that. That's the New World Order DVD. It's 6 hours as well. And so here we see the Pilgrim Fathers bring the Bible to America. Then we see the Pilgrim Fathers' first thanksgiving to God on American soil. Then we see the United States, as those Bible students know, rose as a lamb. And it was no priest nor king, and it was we the people. The US gives liberty to all. They set up a system of we the people with the legislature, the executive and the judicial. It was a lamb because it forced no one in religious matters. It was legislature, made the laws. The executive, which is running the country contrary to the Constitution today, is carrying out those laws and administering the government with them, and the judicial is there to punish those that break the laws. And so we see it was a lamb because it followed the teachings of the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, in Matthew 22:21. Then said he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God, that's the church, the things that are God's. And so they separated church and state. And now we see at this time, Parliament executes Lord, that's Archbishop Laud, despite King Charles's pardon. In 1640, Archbishop Laud was accused of treason. In 1641, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he remained during the early stages of the Civil War. Finally, in 1644, he was tried without a result. Parliament, however, passed a bill of attainder. It was executed in 1645 by Parliament, despite King Charles I giving him a royal pardon. And so this traitor, with a great deal of Protestant blood on his hands, ended up costing his own life. And then the Civil War erupts in England, and of course Oliver Cromwell took the power, not that he wanted it, but here we see, as Edward VI had sworn on the Bible, here we see the Lord Protector of England, Cromwell, swearing on the Bible with the sword of state. He was a Christian, a Puritan, and here we see Cromwell standing on the whore of Revelation 17, which is the papacy, with open Bible in his hand. And now we see Oliver Cromwell read the Bible to his mother every available day. And what a subject for a picture, to see him reading the Bible to his aged mother, who fondly loved him and would have been filled with grief if he had failed in this one single day. That's from the story of The Light That Never Went Out, page 446 by Augusta Cook and W. Stanley Martin. And so we see the closet Catholic Charles I is beheaded. He believed in the divine right of kings, but as the Protestants of England read their Bibles, they found out that men could govern their own affairs. But the Roman Catholics never believed in that. The papacy never, because they believed in the doctrine of original sin, that because we're all guilty of sin and couldn't stop it, then we had to have divinely appointed dictators under the guidance of the church to have a stable society. King Charles I lost the respect of his subjects when he first allowed English warships to be used by the French Catholic king to destroy utterly the Protestants in the city of La Rochelle, across the English Channel. He believed in the divine right of kings, but English parliamentary forces defeated him on the battlefield. On January the 30th, 1649, Charles was executed in Whitehall for being a tyrant, traitor, murderer and enemy of the people. I forgot to tell you that when the English warships were manned by French sailors, they went and helped the French bomb down the walls of La Rochelle. There were 30,000 Protestants inside, men, women and children and friends. When they broke the walls down, the Catholic troops went in there and they killed every single one of them. Here we came, the merry monarch, Charles II, was Charles II came to the throne after his father in 1660, after Cromwell and the Puritans gave up power and Parliament asked him to come back. He too, secret Catholic Charles II, feigns Protestantism to attain the throne in 1660. Charles feigned Protestantism and took a solemn oath not to molest anyone for their religion. He soon broke his oath. He took at Breda to let bygones be bygones and take no revenge on the surviving leaders of the Parliament, which opposed and executed his father. With the restoration of the monarchy came priestism, popery and everything which was the opposite of Puritanism and Protestantism. He also exhumed the body of Cromwell and beheaded him and hung his head put his head on a pike that all could see. Such was the hatred of this king. But we see a pattern emerging here that, remember, Mary Tudor had feigned to look after the Protestant faith, but once she got to power, she changed her mind. They could lie. The end justified the mean for the glory of the Catholic Church. We see Charles II doing exactly the same thing here. It was in the reign of Charles II that John Bunyan was imprisoned for 12 years in the reign of King Charles II for preaching from the Bible without permission. The Church of England made laws, or the Parliament made laws to protect them against Catholics, where no Catholic was allowed in the church to preach. But in so making those laws that the preachers had to be registered or licensed with the Church of England, that meant that if God wanted to raise up men, as he raised up Elijah, John the Baptist, Jesus Christ, Martin Luther, etc., they were just stopping God from raising up men. They were stopping men raising up, God raising up men of his own choice. John Bunyan was raised up of God, but he was put in jail where he stayed for 12 years. King Charles II enforces use of the papalized prayer book on the anniversary of the Bartholomew Night massacre in 1662. Charles II passed the Act of Uniformity on the 19th of May 1662. It was to become law on the 21st of August. He had left the prayer book with its papal mass just as it was and ordered it to become law on the August 24th. This was the anniversary on which 70,000 French Protestants were massacred by Jesuit command. This date was chosen by the Jesuits advising the king. Isn't that interesting? And there we see the Jesuit order's oath. The Jesuits are taught that the end justifies the means. But in Romans 3:8, the Bible contradicts that. And it says, and not rather as we be slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose condemnation is just. And so the Jesuit principle of the end justifying the means. That means for the greater good of the church, they can kill, they can maim, they can do it for the glory of God, contradicts the Bible, Romans 3:8. And now we see Charles II marries a Portuguese Catholic princess. Few know that Charles had been secretly married by a popish priest before the public ceremony. When this merry fornicator took the throne, the moral standards of England were the highest on earth, thanks to the Puritans and the Bible. They rapidly degenerated under this papal dupe. Charles II sends a secret mission to Pope in 1663. Charles II knew that if he declared himself openly a papist, he would lose his throne. He sent a secret mission to Pope Alexander VII at the Vatican in 1663 for instructions on how to bring England back to Rome. You shall know them by their fruits. King Charles desired England to become Catholic. Charles II, it was commonly believed, had been reconciled to Rome when at Breda. He was sincerely desirous to have the Roman religion restored in England, and the leading object of the secret treaty signed at Dover between France and England in 1670 was the advancement of the Popish faith in Great Britain. That's The History of Protestantism, page 581, by Dr. J.A. Wiley. Parliament passed the Test Act designed to keep papists out of office. Then King Charles tried to have it put out, but the Test Acts excluded non-members of the Church of England from public office. It required all office holders under the Crown, including MPs, to receive communion according to the rites of the Church of England at least once a year. They were also required to take oath of supremacy and allegiance to the Crown and to make declaration against transubstantiation, that's the Roman Catholic Mass. This act was aimed particularly at recusant Catholics. And so the Test Act meant that all those in government positions had to take the communion from the Church of England and say on oath that it was not the literal body of Christ, but it was done in commemoration of Christ who died once for all in Romans 6:10. And so that excluded Catholics, and it also said they're not to make that under reservation, because the Jesuits were such liars that they could say, oh yes, I believe is not the body of Christ, that's for the greater good of the church, and when they're actually doing it under reservation. And so under the Mary Fornicator's rule, plague struck England. The moral standards descended in England like the rest of Popery. The plague struck London during King Charles II's reign in 1665. Bring out the dead was the mournful cry heard at nights as carts coursed their way through the city streets, collecting corpses as coffins could not be built fast enough. Bodies were tossed into grisly pits on the outskirts. And so then the Great Fire of London in 1666. 5 Jesuit priests were executed for their complicity in deliberately lighting the fire of London. And here's a monument, the Great Fire of London, 1666, all the sixes there you see, was attributed to the Papists, and an inscription condemning the treachery and malice of the Papist faction remained on this monument until 1830. Tomorrow night you're going to find out why it remained there till 1830, why it was taken off in 1830. At that same time we'd had the plagues, we'd had the Great Fire of London, and we'd had the Dutch Protestants were concerned that the English fleet would be turned Catholic with their king and be used against them. So they sailed up the Thames, up in the Medway, and in 1667 burnt the English fleet. At the same time, King Charles II killed 17,000 Scottish Protestants. Protestants were driven from their homes and pursued by armed soldiers. Secret Catholic King Charles II had killed 17,000 Scottish Covenanters. The Vatican statue shows church persecuting the heretics. You can see the woman with the cross and the sword just out of the picture in the top left, killing the heretics who refused the authority of the church. Every cardinal, archbishop and bishop in the Catholic Church takes an oath of allegiance to the Pope, in which occur the following words: heretics, schismatics and rebels to our said Lord the Pope, or his aforesaid successors, I will to my utmost persecute and oppose. That's from Josiah Strong, Our Country, chapter 5, paragraphs 2 to 4. King Charles II secretly takes papal mass before his death in 1685. Charles's life of deception and wickedness was consummated on his deathbed with a lie. Pretending still to be a Protestant, he received the religious ministration of bishops of the Church of England, refusing only to take the sacrament from them with the excuse that there was time enough. As soon as they had left the room, a Roman priest was admitted secretly, who heard his confession, gave him absolution, and administered the last sacraments of Rome. Parliament believed a Jesuit plot existed to assassinate Charles II and replace him with his fanatical papist brother James. The Parliament, from the evidence laid before it, was convinced of the existence of a plot contrived and carried on by Popish recusants for assassinating and murdering the king, subverting the government, rooting out and destroying the Protestant religion. The House of Lords came to the same conclusion. The Jesuits saw in the zealot James II, that's Charles II younger brother, a better opportunity to overwhelm English Protestantism and restore her to Rome than through the vacillating Charles II, who desired Romanism to triumph in England but would not risk his throne fully. And so Charles II was always a secret Catholic. He was married secretly by a Catholic priest. He was given the last rites by a Catholic priest. He broke his word and executed all those who played a part in his father's death, or the death of his father. He forced the Romanised prayer book on all. He killed thousands of Protestants in Scotland and England. He signed a secret treaty at Dover with Catholic France to destroy Protestantism. He allowed the Jesuits to covertly try to bring the Church of England as close as possible to popery. Although Charles had many illegitimate sons, he had no legitimate heir to the throne. He is also married to a Catholic princess. The Jesuits poisoned Charles in order for his zealous brother to attain the throne and further the cause of Catholicism in England more quickly. And so his zealous brother, James II, came to the throne and reigned for 3 years. And he cooked his goose. He tried too much to bring England back to popery. And what did he say? Remember what Mary Tudor said? I will let people worship according to the dictates of her conscience. Remember what Charles II said? I likewise will do the same. And now we have another Catholic liar. Remember, they believe for the glory of the Pope and the Catholic Church, nothing to do with the glory of Christ, they can tell lies. James promised to preserve the government, both in church and state, as it is now by law established. All the suspicions of the Roman Catholic sovereign seem to have disappeared. We have the word of a king. You're to think they'd have learnt. James promises to keep English church and then holds mass. A quarter of an hour after the death of Charles II, James met his council and assured them he had no fondness for arbitrary power. Arbitrary power is doing away with Parliament and the opinions of the people and ruling by non-elected overpaid Catholic bureaucrats. His aim would be to maintain the rights and liberties of the English Church and of his country. His subjects realised too late that his promises were like pie crust. They were made to be broken. The king, after an interval of 127 years, celebrated a mass at Westminster. At his coronation, he refused to take the oath on the Bible. Remember that every English monarch since Edward VI in 1547, they all swore on the Bible except two. And those two were Mary, Bloody Mary, the Catholic, and James II, the Catholic. King James marries Italian Catholic princess and a Pope's relative. King of France, Louis XIV, chose a second wife for him, James II, in the person of the Princess of Modena and relative of the reigning Pope. And so Roman Catholic King James II suppressed Guy Fawkes celebrations on November the 5th. You'd wonder why that happened? The celebration of the 5th of November was suppressed, and it was forbidden to mention the Popish plot unless it were to attribute it to the Protestant fanatics. And so it was a great conspiracy by the Roman Catholics that was discovered. That's why the Irish bog Irish Catholic Prime Minister in Australia and New Zealand tried to get rid of Guy Fawkes Night. And then we see James II appointed the bigoted Judge Jeffreys. He persecuted thousands of Protestants. One boy was brought before him for reading the Bible, and Jeffreys said to him, "Can you read the Bible?" And he said, "Yes, Your Honour." He said, "Give him a Bible, open it up and read it," because the judge didn't think he could read. And the boy opened the Bible. Just by chance, he read the following words: "Judge not, that you be not judged." And there was silence in the court for a minute or so while the judge reflected on the conviction of the Holy Spirit. Then he continued on his persecution of the saints of God. The papal king seeks to overthrow habeas corpus, which protects our liberties. Remember, that was one of the foundation beliefs of Magna Carta. The king sought also the repeal of the famous Habeas Corpus Act. This law, which was based on Magna Carta, is an important safeguard of English liberty. It prevents unjust detention in prison and requires that justice and right without delay be given to every man. That's the story of the light that never went out, page 478. It's interesting that habeas corpus is one of the things that was taken away by that king, or attempted to take away. Catholic James breaks his oath. The Jesuit priest Petrie becomes James's secret advisor. James filled the government, the army, the universities and civil service with Roman Catholics. James appealed the Anti-Catholic Test Act of 1673, which banned Catholics in conflict with the government. It was outlawed for any person of any rank in any part of the country to preach against the Roman Catholic Church. King James II brought several Catholic regiments from Ireland to suppress the Protestant faith. And then what happened? He tried to make James jail 7 Church of England bishops. These bishops rejected James' command to preach from every pulpit his declaration of indulgence. That's a Catholic doctrine where you can pay money to the church to be forgiven for your sins. Peter, the so-called first Pope, says in 1 Peter that we're not redeemed with filthy lucre, but with the precious blood of Jesus Christ, a free gift of God. So James stacked the bench with Catholic judges, but the great groundswell of the English people caused them to fear for their lives. So the bishops were released, and they became heroes for standing for the truth. The Protestant medal struck to commemorate the release of 7 bishops. The back of the commemorative medal on the right shows the Roman Catholic priest on the left, note the rosary beads on his waist, undermining with pick and shovel the Protestant Church of England under the reign and guidance of King James II. There's another medal struck. This medal was struck after the Jesuits were exposed for attempting to provide a Roman Catholic heir for the English throne. It was said that James, Roman Catholic Queen, had given birth to a son, and the Pope was said to be his godfather. He was nicknamed the Old Pretender, as the Jesuits smuggled the baby into the palace. It wasn't the King and Queen's son at all, but it was guaranteeing a Catholic heir to the throne. The English Protestants burnt the Pope in effigy at Temple Bar in London. And now we see William III. The English were getting upset with James II, who broke his coronation oath and was making rapid progress in making England Catholic again. William III, on being asked to come to England, sent the following declaration on September 30, 1688. We cannot any longer forbear to declare that to our great regret we see that those councillors who have now the chief credit with the King, James II, who overturned the religion, laws and liberties of those British realms and subjected them in all things related to their consciences, liberties and properties of arbitrary government. And so what happened? William of Orange sends his army and navy to save England's Protestant liberties. And there they are arriving in England. The Catholic James II panics and abandons the throne and flees to France. Coming to the throne was William of Orange, William III of the Netherlands, and Mary II. Does anybody know whose father Mary II was? They were both Protestants. They believed in the Bible and not the Pope and the Church's traditions. Mary II was James II, who'd just been deposed, daughter. He was a bigoted Catholic, but she was a Protestant. And William of Orange crossed to Ireland and routs James's Roman Catholic army at the Boyne River. And there it is in 1689. William of Orange wins a great battle against the Catholics. They had found by experience that it was not well for their liberties to have a Roman Catholic sitting on the throne of England. They remembered Mary Tudor, who ruled and killed all those who opposed her, the Protestants. We've just seen the vacillator Charles II, the Mary fornicator, and how he was a secret papist and took the Mass before he died. We also saw that James II, his younger brother, was a fanatical Catholic, and he cooked his goose by trying to force England back to the gates of Rome. And so the English, once and for all, barred Roman Catholics from the throne of England. And people don't realise when they're saying we should allow Catholics on the throne today, they don't understand their English history. And this, the English Parliament brought in the Bill of Rights, and William of Orange, William III, came over from the Netherlands with Mary II, who was a Protestant. They were both Calvinistic Protestants, and Mary II, although she was a Protestant, was the daughter of the just deposed James II, the bigoted Catholic. And part of the Bill of Rights, which was quite extensive, had this statement in it, and it's a pivotal point. The next two slides are pivotal points in the English history determining the liberties we have today, take for granted, and yet still enjoy. I, William and Mary, do swear that I do from my heart abhor, detest and abjure as impious and heretical that damnable doctrine and position that princes excommunicated or deprived by the Pope or any other authority of the See of Rome may be deposed or murdered by their subjects or any other whatsoever. And I do declare that no foreign prince, person, prelate, state or potentate hath or ought to have any jurisdiction, power, superiority, preeminence or authority, ecclesiastical or spiritual, within this realm, so help me God. And so that was part of the Act of Settlement. And we see Article 9, which is most probably the contentious point that both Blair and Brown, before their demise or leaving politics, wanted to cajole the Queen into stepping out of this realm, which forbids the Catholics from attaining the throne. Whereas it has been found by experience that it is inconsistent with the safety and welfare of this Protestant kingdom to be governed by a popish prince or by any king or queen marrying a papist. Every person who is or shall be reconciled to or shall have communion with the See or Church of Rome or shall marry a papist shall be excluded and be forever incapable to inherit, possess or enjoy the crown or government of this realm and island, and in every such case the people of these realms shall be and are hereby released of their allegiance. And so those two statements in the last two slides are pivotal points on our English freedoms. The Act of Settlement was signed. The said crown and government shall from time to time descend to and be enjoyed by such person or persons being Protestant. Just before the devout Protestant Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702, a law was passed that the crown of England, after her death, without direct heirs, should pass to the nearest Protestant branch of the Stuart family. It was this Act of Settlement which brought King George I of the Hanoverian line to the British throne in 1714. The Act of Union shows that the King was also the defender of the Presbyterian faith in Scotland. I will inviolably maintain and preserve the settlement of the true Protestant religion with the government, worship, discipline, rights and privileges of the Church of Scotland, as established by the laws made there in prosecution of the claim of right, and particularly by the Act entitled An Act for Securing the Protestant Religion and the Presbyterian Church Government. The Church of England states Pope is Antichrist. The Westminster Divine, in their Confession of Faith, which was ratified by the English Parliament in 1649, declared, "The Pope of Rome is that Antichrist, that man of sin and of perdition, that exalteth himself in the Church against Christ, and has no jurisdiction in the realm of England." John Milton, the famous Englishman, makes this statement. Milton speaks against papal error. Popery is a double thing to deal with, and it claims a twofold power, ecclesiastical and political. Both usurp, the one supporting the other. Does that mean that means that Popery is a double thing to deal with? It's political and religious. It's union of church and state. And the Catholics, when they're in power, see that they have a right to look after the interests of the Pope and not the people that are paying them. John Bunyan believed the Pope was the Antichrist. Then we see John Knox identifies the Pope as the man of sin. The Roman Catholic Church is the synagogue of Satan, and the head thereof, called the Pope, is the man of sin. The Roman Church is the whore of Babylon and the mother of harlots. The Church of England, or the Presbyterian Church, none of the modern churches today teach those things because it's not politically correct, but because they've been changed by the Jesuits. The beautiful John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, has this to say. John Wesley signed the King's Oath against Popery. Romanism is practically paganism, and no man can be saved by the terms of its covenant. Now we see Charles Dickens typifies England's love for the Bible. In a letter to his son, he writes, "I have put a New Testament among your books because it is the best book that ever was or ever will be known, and teaches you the best lessons by which any human creature who tries to be truthful and faithful to duty can possibly be guided." Then we see the famous Walter Scott held the Bible in awe. This is what he stated: "The most learned, acute and diligent student cannot, in the longest life, obtain an entire knowledge of this one volume. The more deeply he works the mind, the richer and more abundant he finds the ore. New light continually beams from this source of heavenly knowledge to direct the conduct and illustrate the work of God and the ways of men. And he will at last leave the world, confessing that the more he studied the Scriptures, the fuller the conviction he had of his own ignorance and of their inestimable value." Here we see, on the left, we see the simplicity of the primitive godliness of Protestantism, reading the Bibles and sharing it with the little ones together. Here we see the outward part of the outward splendour of the Roman Catholic Church, with their stained glass windows, their beautiful choirs, the incense going up, the priests with their power to forgive sins and turn the bread into the literal body of Christ according to them. These outward attractions satisfy the unsanctified eye, but they can't take the burden of guilt from the heart. The British Parliament tried to emancipate the Roman Catholics in 1780, and the Gordon riots broke out, and there was mayhem in England, and they had to delay the emancipation. Then George III reigned from 1760 to 1820. This is his oath: "Where is the power on earth to absolve me from the observance of every sentence of that oath, particularly the one requiring me to maintain the Protestant Reformed religion? Was not my family seated on the throne for that express purpose? And shall I be the first to suffer it to be undermined, perhaps overturned? No, no. I'd rather beg my bread from door to door throughout England than consent to any such measure. I can give up my crown and retire from power. I can quit my palace and live in a cottage. I can lay my head on a block and lose my life, but I cannot break my oath. If I violate that oath, I am no longer legal sovereign of this country." Now we see the preachings of John Wesley prevented the Protestant, or the mayhem of the beast from the bottomless pit in Revelation 11:7, which caused the French Revolution. Wesley's preaching stopped the revolution from breaking out in England. But the great French church and state were destroyed, the Jesuits were disposed of, 7,000 priests were killed. Then in the reign of George IV, we see he reigned for 10 years, from 1820 to 1830. Not a very well-known king, but nevertheless part of English history. And here the Roman Catholics were emancipated in 1829 in his rule. The British government passed the Catholic Relief Act in 1829. This act removed the most substantial restrictions against Roman Catholics in the United Kingdom. This act was passed as a result of years of campaigning by Roman Catholic Irishman Daniel O'Connell. Remember that when William Orange came over to rule after the bigoted Roman Catholics, James II, no Catholic was allowed on the throne in 1689. No Catholic was allowed on the throne of England. No monarch was allowed to be married to a Catholic, because their first loyalties was always to destroy secretly and subversively the freedoms of the English people and take them back to the Pope, who wanted to rule the world. And there we see the 100-year centenary of the emancipation of the Roman Catholics in Ireland. Remember that when they were emancipated, no Catholic was allowed to live within 14 miles of London after the Great Fire of London. They were not allowed in the ranks of the army, above the rank of sergeant. They were not allowed in politics. They were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed in the diplomatic corps or the universities. Why? Because their first loyalty was always to to uplift the Pope and take away the freedoms of England, destroy the Parliament and rule by arbitrary power. And so we see that the pleas from the Catholics in 1829, they humbly pled, "We only want to worship God according to the dictates of our conscience." Many Protestants at that time warned England that this was only the first step of them regaining their lost ascendancy. And so we're going to find out later just how that humble call in 1828 to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience has been overturned, and now they're arrogantly telling the Queen of England that she can get lost. At that time, the British Bible Society started taking God's word to the world as predicted, as in 1804. The Lord gave the word, great was the company of those that published it, Psalm 68:11. Many Bible students saw that as a means of the beginning of the English taking the Bible to the world. And at that time, what did Pope Pius VIII have to say? Another object of our vigilance is societies which publish new translations of the Scriptures in all vernacular tongues, translations made against the most salutary rules of the Church, and in which the texts are ingeniously wrested to pervert meanings according to the particular spirit. These translations are distributed to all places at great expense. The Holy See has long since warned Christian people, that's Roman Catholics, of this new danger of the faith. Then at that time we saw John Henry Newman go to England. He went to England, and at that time he asked the Pope on what condition, or the Pope's legates, on what condition the Church of England would be allowed back to Rome. In 1833, Newman visited the Vatican, where he asked on what condition the English Church would be received back. The definite answer came back swiftly. The Church of England must accept the Council of Trent. This means papal supremacy, tradition equal to God's word, and the Latin Vulgate Bible, and no other. Newman left Rome stating, "I have a work to do in England." A few days later, the Oxford movement began. As he went back over the Mediterranean to southern France before he took his horse and carriage to England, the English Channel, he wrote a hymn. Do any of you know what that hymn was? Yes, I think you do. It's right. It was "Lead Kindly Light." That's the hymn he wrote on the way back to England. Then in the reign of Victoria, she reigned from 1837, that was 64 years, to 1901. Here we see Queen Victoria, the Protestant Queen, presenting a Bible to an African prince. And this is what she said: because the Jesuits, Newman and Co., started the Tractarian Society, the Oxford movement, and that was to bring as many of the Church of England back to Rome as they could. But the Jesuits, the wily Jesuits, knew full well that they could not take England or get the English to go back to the Church of Rome, because the mothers of England had taught their sons for centuries about the brave Englishmen who were burnt at the stake by Bloody Mary in the 1550s. And so they hated popery. And they knew that the only way they could take Rome, or take England back to Rome, was by infiltrating into the Church of England and subtly changing their doctrines around through Bibles and hymnals until such time as they said, hey presto, the Church of England is really Catholic. The Queen feels more strongly. She was aware of what was going on, incidentally. The Queen feels more strongly than words can express the duty which imposed upon her and her family to maintain the true and real principles and spirit of the Protestant religion. For her family was bought over and placed on the throne of these realms solely to maintain it, and the Queen will not stand the attempts to bring the Church of England as near the Church of Rome as they possibly can. She knew what they were trying to do. Britain becomes the school teacher of the world. They went out with the Bible. William Cowrie translated the Bible in Indian into Hindi. The Protestant Church of England took the Bible to indigenous people around the world. The English Protestants developed new lands, improved standards of the indigenous people. They built churches. They broke in the land. They took the Bible to the indigenous people. They built great dams to harness the power. Look at that for a viaduct that's got a train going over it. They healed the sick. Despite their faults, the sun never set on the far-flung reaches of the Protestant British Empire. Here we have a statement of how it was all financed. Baron Rothschild says he financed the British Empire. And this is his statement from, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire upon which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." And so, despite the fact of England being under the Rothschild money, everybody ended up with a house out of it, or a horse and carriage and some land, although they were in debt to a corrupt banking system. And of course, the Rothschilds held it all together through Freemasonry. Most of our Protestant ancestors were Freemasons, and so it was a Protestant Freemason British Empire, and Rome had lost its ascendancy at the time of the French Revolution, but the Bible warns us that it was to regain its lost ascendancy through the time-serving concessions of the so-called Protestant world. And so the Rothschilds financed the whole British Empire, and they controlled it through Freemasonry. There we see them financing the Glory, the British Navy, meeting. And at that time, while the British Protestants were going around the world, Rome was attempting to reclaim its lost ascendancy. In 1850, the Catholic hierarchical system re-established in England. Remember the emancipation in 1829? Where they were allowed the vote back again, they were allowed in the army and the navy, but they were allowed in politics, but they were not allowed on the throne of England, remember? And that's what they're chasing today, as you'll find out on night 4. But here's the hierarchical system they re-established in England without the English Parliament's approval. Protestant English Prime Minister Lord John Russell protested at the reinstitution of the papal hierarchical system in England in 1850. That's the Protestant Prime Minister there. And the anti-Catholic riots broke out all over Britain, and Punch pictured this papal intrusion as another Guy Fawkes night plot. And all those different bishoprics that you saw on those old fellas dressed in black, all have a bishopric in every city. And here's Cardinal Wiseman prepares to shed blood. He was the man that instigated the hierarchical system in England, and this is what he said. "Daily have I prayed and do pray to him to give me his spirit of fortitude to fight the battles of the church, if necessary unto the shedding of blood." Now remember, Cardinal John Newman left the English church and went over to Rome. There he is pictured on the right. He knew that if he was to bring the English church back to Rome, he had to get a new Bible. And so the superior of the Franciscans, Father Benengo, wishes us to engage in an English translation, authorised translation of the Bible. He is a learned man, and on the Congregation of the Index, what he wished was that we would take the Protestant translation, correct it by the Vulgate, and get it sanctioned here. This might be our first work. And so they set out with Westcott and Hort, the Jesuit lovers, to try and undermine the authorised Bible of the Church of England. And so Cardinal John Newman, he went over to Rome. The Pope made him a cardinal because he took a lot of Englishmen with him, and he was rewarded, but his real reward will be in heaven, one way or the other. And so the Revised Bibles are revisions towards Rome. They tried to tell the English people that the new Bibles were easier to read, easier to understand, made from more ancient manuscripts, and by their own words, made by more intelligent scholars. And yet the small print showed the devil was in the small print, because they were really Catholic Bibles in disguise. It is certainly a remarkable circumstance that so many of the Catholic readings in the New Testament, which Reformation and early post-Reformation times were denounced by Protestants as corruptions of the pure text of God's Word, should now, in the last quarter of the 19th century, be adopted by the revisers of our time-honoured English Bibles. Why is that? Because the Jesuits did it. Then we see the funeral of Queen Victoria. She died in 1901. She was followed by her son, Edward VII, who was a far cry. He was a sacerdotalist. He believed in the ritualism of the Church of England. I believe he had sympathies towards popery because he changed his oath. The oath that he took was changed to allow a less severe rendition of not believing in papal superstitions like the Mass. There we see him taking the oath on the Bible like all the monarchs did. And there we see Edward VII breaks his act of settlement oath. Every person that shall hold communion with the See or Church of Rome shall be excluded and forever incapable to possess the crown and government of Great Britain. Edward VII was the first British monarch since 1688 to visit the Vatican. The blessing he received from Pope Leo XIII quickly turned into a curse of Malachi 2:2, which says, "If you're disobedient, I will curse your blessings." Days after the visit, London received news of the loss of thousands of British soldiers in Africa. And there he is, breaking his coronation oath, visiting Pope Leo XIII, who the Church of England says is the Antichrist and has no jurisdiction in England. And here's some of the dead English troops in the trenches. The curse was certainly put upon them. Now the man of God, Cardinal Manning, he comes to the throne of Roman Catholic new hierarchical system in England after Cardinal Wiseman, and this is what he said. The Cardinal revealed this in the most solemn manner to the late Hugh Price Heiss, London's eminent divine. We're prepared to deluge Europe in blood in order to recover the Pope's temporal power. Does that sound like Jesus? I don't think so. Here's what he said here. Cardinal Manning discloses papal conspiracy to destroy England. It is yours, right reverend fathers, to subjugate and to subdue, to bend and to break the will of an imperial race. You have a great commission to fulfill, and great is the prize for which you strive. England is the head of Protestantism, the centre of its movements, and the stronghold of its powers. Weakened in England, it is paralysed everywhere. Conquered in England, it is conquered throughout the world. Once overthrown here, it is but a war of detail. Now, if as Cardinal Manning said, they wanted to take back England or give the Pope his secular power back by force and blood if necessary, it's logic that they had to unite with a state. Now, they couldn't unite with France because they had kicked them out in 1798 in the Reformation and the Revolution. They couldn't unite with Orthodox Russia. They couldn't unite with Protestant United States. They couldn't unite with England, but they could unite with Catholic Austria and Catholic-controlled Germany. And they were to be the sword of the papacy. We're out to reinstate the Pope. That's what Cardinal Bourne says. He took over after Manning, who took over after Wiseman. We're out to reinstate the Pope. We want him to be the spiritual and ethical leader of this country. We're not hiding that fact at all. Sir Robert Peel warns of a coming religious battle. Sir Robert Peel, twice Prime Minister of England, stated, "The day is not far distant and may be very near when we shall have to fight the battle of the Protestant Reformation over again." William Ewart Gladstone, Prime Minister Gladstone knew popery enslaved mind and body. No one can now become her, that's Rome's convert, without renouncing his civil and moral and mental freedom and placing his civil loyalty and duty at the mercy of another, that is the Pope. Prime Minister Gladstone attacks papal meddling in civil affairs. The most famous pamphlet is Gladstone's The Vatican Decrees on Civil Allegiance, a political expostulation published in 1874, which denounced the Pope for interfering in temporal affairs. And so he was the Prime Minister of England, but Pius IX attacks Prime Minister Gladstone and calls him a viper. Pope Pius IX himself helped the sales of Gladstone's book by calling the Prime Minister a viper, attacking the bark of St. Peter the Vatican. And here we see in the picture of the right, the Pope on the bark of St. Peter, the ship of Popery, coming into port to heaven between Mary on this side and the Eucharist on the other side. And the cry is, "Stick with the ship. Stay with the ships, brother. The ship is going through." That's a Roman Catholic theory. The Jews before tried it, and of course 1.2 million of them perished in the destruction of Jerusalem under Titus and before him Vespasian. And then the Roman Catholic Church taught the same thing, as I mentioned. Along came the Protestant Reformation and said, no, the Bible and the Bible only. Salvation is in Jesus Christ, and you can find Jesus Christ wherever you happen to be. You can find him by your bed at night, under a tree, as Lydia did in Acts 16:13, and many professed Protestant churches who have been given great light today are going back to the Protestant principle that stick with the ship, friends, and you'll be okay. And that is why most of them are going to perish. It says in Matthew 24:37-40, as in the days of Noah, so would it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. There was only 8 saved out of the flood. Prime Minister Disraeli saw pending danger of Rome. We're sinking beneath a power before which the proudest conquerors have grown pale, and by which the nations most devoted to freedom have been enslaved. The power of a foreign priesthood. Your empire and your liberties are more in danger at this moment than when the army of invasion was camped at Boulogne. That's in France under Napoleon. Another former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Prime Minister Lord Balfour, warns against Roman Catholic intolerance. Lord Balfour, once Prime Minister of England, said, "I'm not one of those who think that the difficulties of religious strife are over. Roman Catholics have never abandoned the right when they think it expedient of forcing their doctrines by every means in their power." And so Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, another Prime Minister of England. So these statements are not just coming from nobodies, they're coming from leaders of the realm. I sometimes have a feeling of interference. I want to stress that I have a feeling sometimes that some guiding hand has interfered. I have a feeling that we have a guardian because we have a great cause, and we shall have that guardian as long as we serve that cause faithfully. Here is the very essence of Catholicism. If you remember anything from tonight's presentation, remember this. Villot, a distinguished Roman Catholic, has said regarding Protestants, "When you are masters, we claim perfect liberty for ourselves, as your principles require it. When we are masters, we refuse it to you, as it is contrary to our principles." The question must be asked, should we tolerate those who refuse to tolerate us? G.K. Chesterton demonstrates papal bigotry. The Reformation is wiped out. If the quarrel between the Pope and Luther were to take place today, the whole of the modern world would be on the side of the Pope. The Catholic Church lives. It is the Protestant dogs that are dead. Well, friends, I happen to be a Protestant dog, and I'm not dead yet. And I plan, as long as God gives me breath, to expose the corruption of Rome and tell people of the priceless gift, the free gift of Jesus Christ, who's soon to come back. H.G. Wells sees Rome's hand in English history. The history of England since the Reformation could be written as a recurrent and generally combined attack of the Roman Catholic Church and the totalitarian state upon the common sense, agnosticism and individualism of the English people. Always it is the same story of the renewed assault, apparent success, and then explosion as the English wake up to the trap that's being set. Then, of course, came George V at this time. He reigned from 1910, 26 years, to 1936. He was Edward VII's son. He was also Queen Victoria's grandson. And then he promised his mother, King George V, read his Bible daily. King George V promised his mother, Queen Alexandra, as long ago as 1881, he would read a chapter of the Bible every day, and he had ever since adhered to the promise. They tell how the king wore out his Bibles by diligent use, and how it was his joy to present Bibles as prizes in the village school at Sandringham. And so the admonition of George V to the English peoples: "It has given me sincere pleasure to receive this deputation and to learn that it represents the joint celebration by the English-speaking people of the issue of 1611. This, of course, was the 300th year anniversary of the 1611 authorised King James Bible, of that world-famous translation of the Bible into our tongue, which has ever since been known as the authorised version. The happily chosen words of the address, which your grace has read, bring home to us all the profound importance of that event. The labours of the translators and of my ancestors, King James I, who directed and watched over their undertaking deserve to be held in lasting honour. This glorious and memorable achievement, coming like a broad light in darkness, gave freely to the whole English people the right and the power to search for themselves for the truths and consolations of our faith. And during 300 years, the multiplying millions of the English-speaking races, spreading ever more widely over the surface of the globe, have turned in their need to the grand simplicity of the authorised version and have drawn upon its inexhaustible springs of wisdom, courage and joy. The English Bible binds the English people. Professor Albert Cook adds most valuable testimony to the influence which the Bible exerts in English-speaking communities. The best and wisest of men, he says, the kingly spirits of history, enthroned in the hearts of mighty nations, have declared it, the Bible, to be beyond compare, the most perfect instrument, the only adequate organ of humanity, the organ and instrument of all the gifts, powers and tendencies by which the individual is privileged to rise above himself. The English Bible is the chief bond which holds united in a common loyalty and a common endeavour the various branches of the English race. The influence of the Bible can be traced through the whole course of English literature and English civilization. And more than anything else, it tends to give unity and perpetuity to both. And so the admonition of King George V to the English peoples: it is my confident hope that my subjects may never cease to cherish their noble inheritance in the English Bible, which in a secular aspect is the first of national treasures, and is, as you truly say, in its spiritual significance, the most valuable thing that this world affords. That's through Turmoil to Peace, page 44. The papacy marries itself to the German state. Remember what Cardinal Manning said, that the papacy is prepared to deluge Europe in blood to regain the Pope's secular power. Well, to do that, they had to get a strong arm, and that strong arm was the military might of Germany. The Pope conferred upon the German Emperor and Bismarck the ancient order of Christ. The Chancellor prized this declaration and later said, Pope Leo was one of the most enlightened statesmen of the century. He quickly understood the advantage of having a conservative and well-balanced nation like Germany as the keystone of the arch that upheld European unity and prosperity. Pius X speaks of a great war coming, but this is nothing compared with those in the Gironde to come. Gironde means, Gura is Italian for war, and the suffix one means huge. And so there was a huge war coming. Pope says the greatest war of all time is soon to break. You are lucky indeed, my friends, to be leaving Europe at this moment. You will thus avoid the greatest war of all times, which is just about to break over us all. He said that to the Brazilian minister, Senhor Brazil, relates Pius X's statement in the summer of 1914. There's British troops going over the top to be machine gunned down. Germany was the sword of the Vatican. It was of interest to me, that says the Kaiser, that the Pope said to me on this occasion that Germany was to become the sword of the Catholic Church. And here we see this artist showing three signs. There's the hand sign, Church and State united, the halo and the cross all show the influence of the Vatican on the German state. The Vatican and Germany in partnership. The Pope continues his daydreams, his gaze turned tenderly towards Germany. The country always represents for him the advanced sentinel of the West, guarding Europe against the heinous schismatic East, that's the Orthodox Church. Germany, for her part, is well aware of this entente with the Vatican. The Pope is no agent so active on his behalf than the German Catholic bishops. Everywhere the German Catholics, under the direction of the spiritual leaders, are working indefatigably for Germany and the Pope, as if Germany and the Pope were one of the same thing. Dispatched December 19th, 1915. The Vatican works with German government to defeat the Slav religion. All the information I have persuades me that the major preoccupation of Vatican in the war to form a front against the detestable Slav religion. That's the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox. I'm convinced that the Vatican is in close touch with the German government. And here we see again the Kaiser in this artist's impression with the cross showing his reliance on the church. The Pope sows dissent between Italy and France. This attempt by Pius X to sow dissension between two great peoples on the occasion of their reconciliation. After this episode, what is required now is complete emancipation of France from political interference by Rome. Separation has become a national necessity, and so to get the church out of the state. Count Melgar encounters Catholics at all levels of British Parliament. Count Melgar, a distinguished Spanish nobleman and devoted Catholic, visited England in 1916. He wrote this account: "The most profound impression I brought away from this contact with official England was an utter amazement at the remarkable number of Catholics I encountered holding the highest positions in the administration of the state." After the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where the Germans were tipped off that the British were coming and hundreds of machine guns was lined up against British youth, the English-speaking Commonwealth countries, 60,000 casualties before lunch on the opening morning. The many Catholics were sacked from their position of power after that. The Vatican is the sly instigator of the war. A few years before 1914, M. Weiss Guyot, a true prophet, said, "If war breaks out, listen, you men who think that the Roman Church is a symbol of order and peace, and do not search for blame outside the Vatican. It will be the sly instigator, as in the War of 1870. At that time, Pope Benedict XV bought the Irish. He knew about and blessed the Irish uprising while the British troops were in Europe. They caused a Catholic uprising in Ireland. And Pope was banned from officiating at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I. Catholic priests burned the Bibles in the streets of Rome. The Bible was publicly burnt in the streets of Rome in the presence of a large concourse of people, presided over by dignitaries of the Catholic Church in front of the Church of St. Maria in Dominica. And so, friends, we're going to finish our second night's presentation at that point. We see Rome as trying to regain its lost ascendancy over the Protestant nations, and it's prepared to unite, as the Church and State says, the fingers indicate, to unite with the states and use them to implicate its doctrine. Thank you for coming tonight. I'll welcome you back tomorrow night.